All right, guys, Professor Tatum back at it once again. Here we'll be looking at Reconstruction once again, but now we'll be looking at it through the perspective of freed people and their political struggles. So, as usual, we'll start out with a little bit of context. Then we're going to examine freed people's role and place in Reconstruction. Then we will look at some successes that occurred for freed people throughout Reconstruction. We'll also look at some shortcomings or setbacks and stagnation for freed peoples. And we'll also look at the aftermath of Reconstruction and what it meant for freed people. A few things to remember. Reconstruction refers to this period that began toward the end of the Civil War, continued immediately following the Civil War, and it included efforts to reconstruct the war-torn South and bring it back into the nation. We need to remember some of the key issues and questions that were driving Reconstruction. Some of these we've already grappled with in our previous lecture. Some of them we'll be looking into a little more here. So we looked, for example, in our last lecture at things like how to handle former Confederates, what to do with the former Confederate states who had left the Union, and who would lead the Reconstruction of the South. But what we need to still grapple with is the question of what to do with enslaved people. Remember, some people suggested they should all be freed, since some, as we'll see, were being freed by the end of the Civil War. Others were saying perhaps only some should be freed. And then from there, as they're freed, there's the question of what to do with freed people. Should they be granted citizenship and equal rights to other Americans? We've also got to keep in mind our big picture Unit 1 questions of how Reconstruction in the South fits into this big metaphorical reconstruction of the nation into a new America after the Civil War. Remember, individuals both in North and South, as well as historians moving forward, view the Civil War as a sort of metaphorical second American Revolution and know that the nation that will emerge after the Civil War will be far different than the nation that existed before the Civil War. All right. And remember, we're trying to understand how does what's going on in Reconstruction fit into this larger reconstruction of this modern nation? And the key question I want us to be thinking about throughout this lecture is how well did Reconstruction secure justice for freed people? Star it, write it, highlight it, get it wherever you need it. Keep this in mind as you're taking notes moving forward. How well did Reconstruction secure justice for freed people? And we need to remember there were several different plans and policies put into place throughout this period of Reconstruction. And throughout each of these periods, as different individuals were implementing their plans and policies, they all impacted freed people in different ways. And freed people played different roles throughout each step of the process here. But we can remember President Lincoln's plan. So he came up with that 10% plan, very lenient. He only required 10% of voters to agree in each state to repudiate secession and move forward as good Americans, right? Lincoln was also interested by the end of the war in ending slavery throughout the nation. All right, again, we're going to see moving forward. He's already taken efforts toward ending slavery in certain areas. It started out more kind of as a political, strategic move during the Civil War. But through his writings by the end of his life, we can kind of see that Lincoln's views on slavery have started to adapt toward having a more kind of moral crusade toward ending slavery as well. President Andrew Johnson, we need to remember, he set very lenient conditions for the former Confederates. He granted most of them a general amnesty. Few exceptions there for the leaders and wealthiest members of Confederate society. And after setting these very lenient conditions, he kind of just turned a blind eye to what Southerners were doing. And they took advantage of this and abused their power. Now we need to understand that's going to have some serious ramifications for African Americans, okay? And Johnson was okay with that. He was not interested in ending slavery, and he opposed ideas of African Americans gaining things like citizenship and suffrage. And Congress, remember the loudest voices in Congress throughout Reconstruction were these radical Republicans led by people like Thaddeus Stevens here. Also, Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis, who had proposed that Wade-Davis bill to counter Lincoln's plan. And they had some somewhat more strict conditions for former Confederates, right? I'm not going to say that their plan was harsh by any means, considering, remember, mass executions, normally the means for handling mass treason. Not seeing anything like that happening here. But they did require former Confederates to take the ironclad oath in order to vote or hold office. Remember that ironclad oath was an oath in which a person swore that they had never served the Confederacy in government or in military. All right. And we need to also remember that these guys were allies of freed people, right? They advocated first full-on abolition. And then after that, they wanted to bring things like citizenship, equal protection, and the right to vote for African Americans. All right, they're interested in having equal protection of the law for people of all races. So one thing we really need to understand is that freed people throughout this period of Reconstruction were not just pawns being acted upon. Okay, they were playing key roles in this moment in U.S. history. All right, in the study of history, we refer to this as agency. Agency is recognizing the role that a person played in history, bringing voices to those individuals who we know were key players in history, who have perhaps been marginalized in traditional historical narrative. So, following the train of thought of a historian named Stephen Hahn, I'm going to suggest that African Americans were heavily involved in political struggles and community building long before Reconstruction. All right, throughout their time and during slavery, they found ways to participate in politics. Some of you may be wondering, how the hell is that? They couldn't even read or write. They were banned from doing that. How are they going to participate in politics? Well, remember, the very broad definition of politics that I shared with the class earlier actually comes from Stephen Hahn here. Viewing politics as a collective struggle for what might be termed socially meaningful power. We can absolutely see that African Americans were very heavily engaged in that during their time as enslaved people. As Hahn suggests, Black political struggles, both inside and outside of the electoral arena, decisively shaped the South and the nation. Okay, African Americans were doing things like communicating with one another across plantations, using songs, hand signals, art, etc., to send each other certain types of messages. They would listen in to conversations held by their enslavers and try to gain their own understanding of what was happening around the nation politically and interpret their own meaning of what that meant for themselves and share that news with one another. They also found different ways to contribute directly to the Civil War. Right, many of them fled from their plantations and joined the Union Army. We can see definitely freed people had a very active role in building their own communities, and they were very politically active throughout the Civil War. So African Americans' political action would continue into Reconstruction. All right, in Reconstruction, they would not only continue with that networking and struggling toward what was meant toward what they considered to be a meaningful sense of power, but they also got directly involved during this period in electoral politics. Okay, so there were individuals actually being elected into office and serving in government during this period of Reconstruction. So the key point I want us to get out of all of this is that freed people were key players in Reconstruction. All right, they have that agency. They are historical actors contributing to this historical narrative. They're not just pawns being acted upon. Okay, they're not just waiting around for politicians to make decisions or for the Union Army to have victories. They are contributing to this. They are having their own thoughts, experiences, and political participation throughout this entire process. And we need to be aware of what the key goals of freed people were throughout this process of Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, freed people were trying to do things like unite with families. We need to keep in mind many families had been torn apart, both by slavery and by the Civil War. Very simply, many of them were just trying to express their human dignity as freed people. Many African Americans were trying to find ways to push toward gaining full-fledged citizenship, including voting rights. Many also began empowering themselves by gaining educations, which had been forbidden to many enslaved people for quite some time. And a big goal for many freed people was land ownership. Okay, we need to understand this one here. It has quite a bit of a different meaning than it does in the 21st century. Okay, in the present day, it's pretty badass if you can own something of your own. There's a sense of status that comes with that. There's a sense of accomplishment, taking a little pride, and this is my property. I'm going to care for it. Much different meaning, though, in the 19th century, okay? Meaning in the 1800s. We need to understand that just a few decades before this, several states still had property ownership as a basic requirement for people to even do things like being able to vote, all right? So land ownership was kind of a baseline status that a person had to acquire if they really wanted to have any kind of standing in society, and if they ever wanted a chance of being taken seriously and having any kind of social mobility or economic mobility. All right, so we need to understand land ownership is crucial to the majority of freed people throughout Reconstruction. So what we'll look at next are some successes in Reconstruction, followed by some shortcomings, failures, and these are all crucial to understanding Reconstruction. I kind of follow the school of thought of Eric Foner, who sees Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution. All right, we can see this very transformative, radical moment starting to take off during Reconstruction, in which all kinds of very significant changes are occurring. But then there's also a lot of setbacks that kind of prevent them from really going off in full force. Yet the foundations we see set in this moment will continue to be grappled with by Americans moving forward. And even into the present day, we're still seeing a lot of these same issues come up in different ways. So we can definitely see Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution. An early success during Reconstruction, I'd kind of say this is the starting point, perhaps, of Reconstruction, is the Emancipation Proclamation. So, the Emancipation Proclamation, we've probably all heard of it sometime, but this is a largely misunderstood document. Okay, I've heard some people say that this is what ended slavery. Not quite accurate, somewhat, not exactly. I've heard other people say, well, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free a single slave. And that is total malarkey. All right. So let's take a look at this thing. Let's look at some key passages from the document itself and see what it is that it did here. So here's a couple of excerpts from the proclamation that really sum up what it does. Okay. It says all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, key point, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Okay, so that kind of declares one thing it does there. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, position stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. All right, so we really see two key things going on here. This is absolutely granting freedom to some enslaved people, but not throughout the entire nation. Look, this is saying only in states or parts of states that are in rebellion against the United States, all right, which in this case would be Confederate controlled territory. Okay, so one thing this proclamation did is it freed enslaved people in Confederate territory, right? Boom, that's one point. Second major point that is crucial to understanding this document, so don't stop there. Crucial point here is that it's also allowing these same said people to join the United States Armed Services. Okay. All right, so let's think about this. What is the goal of this thing? Why is it only freeing enslaved people in rebel territory? Right? Some people will argue, oh, we'll see, the U.S. didn't actually have jurisdiction over that territory. It was in Confederate hands, so they couldn't really enforce it. So this whole thing's just a sham. No, you're missing the whole point, all right? Because not only is it freeing these people in this Confederate territory, which is in theory controlled by this quasi Confederate government, but it's also, remember, encouraging these people to come join the Union Army, all right, saying you will be welcomed into the armed services. So the goal here is clearly to weaken the South. You need to understand the South's economy, their political and social hierarchy is all based around this institution of slavery, okay, of having a class of subordinated people compared to those who are above those subordinated people, all right? Without that, their whole kind of order falls apart. So what Lincoln was trying to do here was encourage large numbers of enslaved people to leave the South and join the Union Army, all right? This will be very crippling to the South. All right, so let's consider again here this historical significance. Remember, historical significance, do not overcomplicate it. It's always just one of these things here. Was it the first of something, the last of something? Did it lead to something else? Did it demonstrate something else? Or was it an example of something else? Okay. And I can tell you what this thing was, right? It was a proclamation passed by Lincoln during the war. What did it do? It freed enslaved people in Confederate controlled territory and welcomed them to join the U.S. Army. It was historically significant because it led to thousands of enslaved people fleeing from the South and joining the U.S. military. All right, once again, that was very crippling to the South, but it's also very beneficial to the U.S. Army. Now they're getting all these extra troops fighting on their side. So let you guys take that information and practice filling in the blanks to make this into an ID term. So all you're going to do is fill in these blanks here, all right? Let you pause the video in a second here and write this all out. Just use this stem here to help you. Okay, you'll start with these words. The Emancipation Proclamation was, and then you'll finish that sentence. You can write 1 to 3 complete sentences there, whatever you find is necessary within 1 to 3 sentences to tell me what it was and what happened with it. Okay, so we can say the Emancipation Proclamation was this document created during the war. Here's what it did. Boom. That's probably 2 sentences tops. Okay, then we're going to start our next part of the response. The Emancipation Proclamation was historically significant because, and then again, finish that sentence. If you need to write a little more, I'll give you up to 3 sentences. The goal with these is to very concisely, get to the point in a few words and get it out there, all right? What was it? What happened with it? Why was it historically significant? Don't overcomplicate it. Just go fill in the blanks, all right? And go fill only in what information is necessary. Go ahead and pause the video now. Find the lecture activity related to this. Knock that out. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm available via email. Quick reminder before you pause. Do not use outside sources. The whole goal here is to look at what I've provided and make sense of that. All right, we're looking at the document itself. You shouldn't have to go pulling information off of Google. Definitely shouldn't be pulling shit off ChatGPT. No. Use what I provide to you here. You have all the information you need. Just go fill in the blanks and start back on the lecture once you knock that out. Another major success, in addition to the Emancipation Proclamation during Reconstruction, was General Sherman's Field Order 15, sometimes referred to as Special Field Order 15. So this was a short-lived temporary success, but very much success for freed people. This was a field order led by this Union Army commander here, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, and he, under this field order, distributed out confiscated lands to freed people. And this was all land that had been confiscated from Confederates during the Civil War. And as you might imagine, this did face a lot of pushback from adversaries. Okay, people like President Andrew Johnson, who was openly racist, not interested in civil rights, wanting to let states make decisions on their own, was pretty upset that this Union generals out here giving away former Confederate territory to African Americans and giving them a kind of starting point to work from. So we're going to see what happens here is Johnson's going to eventually reverse this field order and evict hundreds of African Americans from their homes. So imagine this, being an enslaved person, you've been granted emancipation, and then here comes this Union officer telling you, hey, I've got you land, I've got you a home, I've got you a starting point. This, by the way, is where we get that term 40 acres and a mule. So here's a nice chunk of land. We've even brought you an old war mule to help you get started with some work. And then a few months later, knock on the door. Here comes the Union Army again saying, hey, so I know we told you guys you could have this land, but you gotta go, all right? Orders from up top. President's not too happy about this. All right, very, very devastating for freed people. Getting an opportunity, it seemed, and then quite literally being just thrown out to the wayside and having to take things from there. So not only did this lead to hundreds of African American families being landless, but it also left them in situations where, in many cases, they were dependent on landowners who were usually white Southern elites for survival, essentially. All right. But despite its ultimate failure, Field Order 15 led to continued efforts of land redistribution to try to help freed people gain access to land. Remember, that was a key goal for freed people. Okay, another success for freed people during Reconstruction came from this organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a temporarily funded agency that was opened toward the end of the Civil War to help freed people transition into free life. They provided freed people with all kinds of services, from food to clothing, shelter, helping them gain employment, helping explain employment contracts to them. Remember, most freed people could not read or write, so they need somebody to make sure they're not getting cheated. In some cases, that didn't always work out so well. Many of them got cheated anyway. They also helped provide legal aid if there was any kind of legal dispute. They also helped oversee and legally recognize marriages between African Americans. And another very crucial role they played was helping reunite families. All right. So, say for example, a man comes into a Freedmen's Bureau office in a certain town in Mississippi. He's a 6 foot tall black man with a scar under his left eye. His name is Joe, we'll say, and he tells the Freedmen's Bureau clerk that he's looking for his sister Susie, right? And he gives a description of Susie. He says, "Last I heard, she was in such and such town in Louisiana. I'm not sure if she's still there or not." Well, that Freedmen's Bureau clerk could then send a telegram over to the office in that town in Louisiana saying, "Hey, if you have anybody coming into your office who fits this description, looking for a 6 foot man named Joe with a scar under his left eye, let me know because I know this guy." All right. And they could help people get back in touch that way. But one of the most revolutionary things the Freedmen's Bureau did was help establish schools for freed people. They sent all kinds of teachers to the South. They also helped train new teachers. But we need to keep in mind just how revolutionary this is. These are things we take for granted in the 21st century. But remember, enslaved people had been legally banned from receiving that basic education. They were unable to learn how to read and to write. Why is that? Why would you deny a human being of such basic skills? Well, very good for you to know as college students, this is a form of power, okay? One historian who looks at education in Reconstruction argues that education always and everywhere is political. Political, again, remember, meaning linked to some form of socially meaningful power. And this is nothing new to this period of Reconstruction. Philosophers, hundreds of years before, were saying things like, we should not trust the masses who say that only the free can be educated, but rather the lovers of wisdom who say that only the educated are free, right? That's a quote from a Stoic philosopher named Epictetus. To put this all simply, in very basic 21st century Professor Tatum language, education is power. You guys, by simply being here enrolled in this class, have a great opportunity to empower yourselves. How you're going to empower yourself, though, is up to you. All right. So don't give this power away to fucking robots, AI, just looking up shit on Google. That's robbing yourself of basic skills and robbing yourself of power. Use those things to empower you, to enhance you, to improve you, so you can have this power and exercise it in a way that so many people throughout history have worked so hard to make a possibility for us. All right, off my soapbox. That's a topic that I get very passionate about, obviously, uh, but it's very relevant. So there's something I think is worth noting on this topic of education. There's been a stereotype about these teachers sent by the Freedmen's Bureau. People suggest often that these were white teachers sent from the North and that they were really there to push their Northern capitalist agenda onto the people of the South. This was used as justification to push back against the Freedmen's Bureau, first by historians of the Dunning School, later by post revisionists who had a very cynical view of Reconstruction. But the realities, as studied by some later historians of the late 20th century and 21st century, have helped us see that this is quite an oversimplification. All right, that there was actually 1/3 of the teachers in the South were African American. A quarter of these teachers who were white were actually from the South as well. Right, they're not people coming from the North pushing their agendas. A good chunk of them are Southerners. Why does this matter? Why am I getting caught up in these little details here? I can understand that at first glance this may all seem trivial, but I think this shows us a lot about how the study of history works and why it's crucial to continue to study history and have conversations based around the study of history. This shows us, on the one hand, that there are so many things throughout history that we just kind of start to take for granted. All right, we tell this narrative in a certain way over and over and over, and we come to assume because it's been said a certain way for so long, over and over by so many different people, that it must be true. All right. But if we're willing to go re examine evidence and look a little more closely, we can often see that the things we've taken for granted and said over and over are maybe a little more complicated than we've given them credit for. Furthermore, this shows us we have a third of the teachers in the South being African American. That provides us a great example of freed people expressing their agency and playing a very active role directly in education, sharing their education they're gaining with one another. This always just fascinates me, and I think it's certainly worth sharing. All right, the Freedmen's Bureau, though, did have some shortcomings, made it kind of difficult for them to own up to their full potential and really do everything they wanted to. They were consistently underfunded and understaffed. They were also unable to provide the very crucial service of providing land to African Americans, which was a part of their major goal. The full title of their organization was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Perhaps confiscated lands would be the better word there. All right, that's referring to those lands confiscated by Confederates in the South during the Civil War. And the Freedmen's Bureau had goals similar to those laid out by Field Order 15 to provide that land to freed people. However, as a result of their lack of funding, lack of manpower, and continued fierce resistance, they were unable to provide freed people with land. So this is two cases here where we've seen this glimmer of hope for freed people to gain access to land to get that fair standing, which have not ended up being carried through. In addition to the services of the Freedmen's Bureau, the land provided to some temporarily from Field Order 15 and the emancipation granted to several freed people through the Emancipation Proclamation. There were also a series of constitutional amendments which not only brought an end to slavery, but brought all kinds of protections of basic civil rights for freed people. These are some of the most revolutionary amendments of the U.S. Constitution. A lot of what we take for granted in the United States as what it means to be an American and what our country really stands for come from this moment of Reconstruction through these Reconstruction amendments. Okay, so starting with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was passed by President Lincoln and Congress. This amendment was passed to ban slavery in all parts of the United States. Now, they really wanted to make this a constitutional amendment for a couple reasons. All right, number one, if they just made it a federal law, well, another president and another Congress later down the road could come into office and overturn the law pretty easily. A constitutional amendment is pretty difficult to overturn. It takes a lot of unified effort to overturn a constitutional amendment. They really wanted this long term. Also, though, we got to think of what the U.S. Constitution really is. It is the framework of American government. It essentially says, in a way, what the United States is and what it stands for. All right, and it kind of sets here's the rights that people have. Here's the rights that government has and does not have. Here's the rights that people do not have. So it kind of defines the restrictions, limitations, and the freedoms of both the common people and the government in the United States, right? And by incorporating this idea of having no slavery into that document, it makes it a part of the United States. Okay, so we can see this as a part of making this issue of ending slavery a part of the new America being constructed after the Civil War. But of course, as you guys should have seen by now, there is an unfortunate major loophole in the 13th Amendment, right? If we look at the text of the 13th Amendment, it says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. That's a pretty big loophole. Hold that thought. That's going to be important moving forward. So while President Lincoln played a key role in getting this 13th Amendment together, he did not live to see it enacted because before he could, he was, of course, assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Talked a little bit through that assassination in the previous video. Again, if you're interested in learning a little more about it, let me know. I'll send some things your way. However, following Lincoln's assassination, Congress carried through with getting the 13th Amendment ratified, and it was added to the U.S. Constitution. So we now have an official ban on slavery and involuntary servitude embedded in the fabric of the U.S. Constitution. Then there's the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment I consider to be the most radical constitutional amendment besides the First Amendment. All kinds of ideas of what it means to be an American. Things like equal rights for all Americans regardless of race. Things like the idea of birthright citizenship. All come from this 14th Amendment, right? Among many other things, this amendment defined American citizenship. Of course, you've already read this, seen a little bit about it by now. You know that in addition to defining citizenship as something granted to all people born or naturalized in the United States, also guarantees equal protections and due process under the law to all people in the United States. Also banned any individuals who are participating in a rebellion or insurrection from serving in government. Oops. Very, very radical constitutional amendment. What we really need to understand, though, is that this granted citizenship to African Americans, all right? People who had been enslaved before the Civil War are suddenly made into citizens with full-fledged rights of citizens and equal protections as all other citizens of the nation. Again, this is revolutionary beyond belief, something we take for granted in the 21st century, but this is the first time this has happened so quickly and on such a large scale in world history. So, as Congress was trying to get this amendment to pass, they knew that they were going to need to get it ratified or approved by 3/4 of the states. President Johnson also knew that. We need to remember President Johnson, he is openly racist. He kind of wants to sit back and let the South take control of Reconstruction after following his basic guidelines. He's not interested in things like African Americans having equal rights. So he's going to try to resist this. He came up with a plan known as the Swing Around the Circle Tour. He went through all these major cities throughout the country, trying to persuade people to not ratify the 14th Amendment. Okay. Problem was, it seems quite likely that President Johnson was taking a little sip here and there from a flask. If I was giving this lecture in person, I would, at this point in the lecture, be running around the classroom drinking out of a flask, water, of course, yelling at all you guys about how you should not ratify that 14th Amendment and how it's a sham that people like Thaddeus Stevens are trying to force onto you. All right. And that's basically what Johnson did. All right. He made a total fool of himself. And in the process, he said a lot of very ugly things to members of the American public. So this Swing Around the Circle tour really kind of bit Johnson in the ass. And in turn, Congress was able to get enough support from 3/4 of the states to get it ratified and passed. So the Swing Around the Circle tour was a tour led by Andrew Johnson to try to stop states from ratifying the 14th Amendment. And we can say that it was historically significant because it led to decreased support for President Johnson and increased support for the 14th Amendment. Okay, boom, I just gave you an exam answer. Write that down. All right, last but not least, there was the 15th Amendment. This amendment, of course, protected the right to vote for all male U.S. citizens, regardless of race. Again, this is granting that right to vote and protecting it nationally for freed people, saying no state can try to deny a person the right to vote based on their race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? So if you were enslaved, if you're black, it doesn't matter. You still have that right to go and vote like any other citizen. One major shortcoming, though, of the 15th Amendment was that it only guaranteed this right to vote to all men, regardless of race. Women continued to be disenfranchised. So another key success for free people during Reconstruction was that many African Americans did begin to serve directly in political office. All right. For example, we can look to Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels was an African American politician in Mississippi during Reconstruction, and we can say he's pretty historically significant because he was the first African American senator in the United States. By the way, if you're writing that as an ID term, that's all the information you need. There's no need to go Googling and figuring out all these things that I didn't mention there. We know who he was, what he did. He was an African American politician during Reconstruction. And we know that he's historically significant because he was the first African American senator in the United States. You could also take this a step further and see perhaps that he's an example of African Americans who were serving in political office during Reconstruction. Pretty dang significant and definitely a key success for freed people during this period of Reconstruction. So we've seen some successes, some of them holding more weight than others, some of them having more immediate action and lasting impacts than others. But we do need to understand that in many cases, Reconstruction was kind of taking 2 steps forward and 4 steps back, so to speak. Right? There's a great deal of setbacks and a great deal of stagnation in terms of progress being made for freed people. Okay. So one place we really see this is with the failure of land redistribution. Remember, President Johnson had reversed Field Order 15, evicting several families of freed people who had very temporary access to land of their own. And then the Freedmen's Bureau were met with fierce resistance, ultimately unsuccessful. And this all left thousands of African American families homeless and led to many landless African Americans, depending on mostly white landowners, for shelter and economic opportunities. There were also continued efforts to keep African Americans subordinated despite the progress that they were making during Reconstruction. So remember, for example, when President Johnson was turning a blind eye to what the South was doing, many southern states began passing black codes. Remember, black codes were those laws that specifically targeted African Americans and restricted their rights. These involved things like setting curfews for African Americans, requiring African Americans to at all times have proof of employment. Those who could not meet that condition were considered vagrants, and therefore, vagrancy was a crime which could lead to arrest. And then consider this makes African Americans also particularly susceptible, as I discussed before, to that loophole in the 13th Amendment. Remember that loophole in the 13th Amendment allows for slavery or involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. So imagine one of these young African American men here may have had his paperwork proving he could work. Maybe he's leaving late because his boss kept him up late, and he's on his way home and he gets stopped by a cop. The cop says, "What are you doing out here so late? You're supposed to be home by now. That's already a violation of one of our black codes." And he says, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm on my way home. Just been working late." And the cop says, "Oh, so you've been working, huh? Why don't you show me proof of your employment?" And say maybe he has that proof of employment with him and he's been working all day out in the sun and he's sweating and he's been getting covered in dirt, and that permit showing that he has the right to work has gotten damaged. Well, then the cop can say, "I can't really see this, so until I can verify with the judge that this is a legitimate permit to work, you're going to sit in jail." All right, then say maybe while he's in jail, someone in there's picking on him, maybe trying to take his food, take his shoes, God, who knows? And he gets in a fight in there. Boom, then he catches a second charge. Now he's being convicted of a crime. Then from there, he can fall under that loophole in the 13th Amendment and be used for forced labor. And this was all heavily reinforced by a system known as the convict lease system. Convict lease system, in short, is a system in which prisons and jails would lease out convicts for labor to private industries and private individuals and even private plantations. All right. So in many cases, through this convict lease system, prisons are making profits by renting out slave labor. Well, I do want to point out that while African Americans were particularly susceptible to falling into this convict lease system, first through black codes, and then later, as we'll see, through Jim Crow laws, there were several poor white individuals and other minority groups around the country who were also very susceptible to falling into this convict lease system and being used as free labor while prisons and jails were making a profit in turn by leasing them out. Go ahead and pause here, review this video, respond to the questions you have on it, and go ahead and wrap up from here. Okay, so what we need to understand is putting all this together into perspective. We have this loophole in the 13th Amendment, which, along with black codes and the convict lease system, led to a continued use of slave labor despite the 13th Amendment. Definitely some significant setbacks here for African Americans during Reconstruction. By the way, this text to the 13th Amendment still says the exact same thing. This is still technically on the books. There have been laws passed saying that prisoners must be paid a few cents per hour and bullshit like that to kind of justify, say, oh, it's not really slavery. But that text is still there in the Constitution, and a few cents an hour when there is a federal minimum wage sure starts to look a lot like slavery. Another place that free people faced a good deal of setbacks was in terms of racial and political violence. So there was very significant amounts of violence and intimidation throughout Reconstruction, as I suggested in the last lecture. Great deal of race riots, lynchings, etc. Of course, there were groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, the White League, organizations who were very cloak and dagger, would go take people out into the woods and kill them. But it wasn't always that secret, okay? It wasn't always just these cloak and dagger organizations. In many cases, these were public lynch mobs, all right? And in many cases, those led to very public race riots. And this mass violence also served as a deterrent to continue to suppress the right to vote for African Americans as well as their political supporters. All right. And this was all fueled very heavily through propaganda. So remember, we'd seen that supporters of freed people were individuals known as carpetbaggers who came down from the north and participated in Reconstruction in some way or another. And then there were scalawags, who were Southerners who supported Reconstruction. And we can derive here from this political cartoon, this guy here is carrying a carpet bag from a northern state. We can only kind of assume that must be a scalawag there with him being hung. And here we have a very interesting image of a donkey, which is, of course, the symbol of the Democratic Party, labeled KKK, showing that the Ku Klux Klan here believes that by committing murder of people like carpetbaggers and scalawags, they are promoting the political agenda of the Democratic Party in this period. All right, again, I put a disclaimer about this up there, but I need everybody to note that trying to draw direct comparisons between the Democratic and Republican Party of the 21st century to the Democratic and Republican Party this period is going to get you very, very confused. So don't do that, okay? But this is certainly a very real setback, in this case, not only for free people, but also for their supporters. Then, of course, there's the whole process of redemption. Remember, if we can see Reconstruction as a revolution for freed people, redemption was essentially a counter-revolution led by those who opposed Reconstruction. Remember, redemption was when there were collective efforts of the Democratic Party to reassert its dominance throughout the South and bring a whole bunch of former Confederate leaders as well as pro-Confederate elites back into power in the South. And you can only imagine that this did not work out so well for free people, okay? A lot of the progress that was made in terms of protecting civil rights at the state and local level was being diminished throughout this process of redemption. Then remember, Reconstruction came to a close with the Compromise of 1877. It was kind of cut short, brought to a very abrupt end. Remember that compromise was a kind of shady backroom deal between Republicans and Democrats to settle the disputed presidential election of 1876, in which the Democrats allowed the Republican President Hayes to become president, but in exchange, Hayes had to agree to do some things for Democrats, top of the list, bring an end to Reconstruction. Remember, this led to the end of Reconstruction. So what that really means is the final military troops who were down in the South, providing protections for African Americans and their supporters from things like this, were now being pulled out of the South. They were kind of left to fend for themselves. So in the next lecture, we'll start looking a bit at the aftermath of Reconstruction. But very briefly, I can tell you it led to pretty much continued subordination of African Americans, definitely a lot of continued oppression and repression for African Americans, definitely a lot of continued political and racial violence. But we'll also see continued efforts of African Americans to practice their own form of politics and continue to express their agency. We'll pick up here next lecture. Over and out.